Hello, welcome to the first episode of our Macbeth GCSE series. We're about 10 or 11 weeks out from the GCSEs and end of years right now. So here are some small groups to help you with some of the major characters, themes, context, essay writing, all of that good stuff for Macbeth as your Shakespeare play. So over the course of the next few weeks, what we're going to be looking at, some of the major characters, we'll be looking at Macbeth, Lady Macbeth, Macduff, Malcolm. We'll also sneak in a bit of Duncan, Donalbain, Lennox, some of the other characters as we talk about them. They're the most likely characters to come up in an essay in your GCSEs. We'll be talking about some of the major themes as well. We'll be talking about good versus evil, appearance versus reality, violence, supernatural. I should add that in there. I can't believe I didn't put that one. And again, these are the common themes that will come up most likely as part of your GCSE essay. We'll also talk about sort of Shakespeare as a playwright. We'll talk about Jacobean England. We'll do some model paragraphs and answers. We'll think about how to plan the answers. We'll think about how to write the answers. A lot of the lessons, I'll do a little model sort of paragraph towards the end of the lesson as well. And then for some of the lessons, we'll also do like a little bit of a Q&A. So if you have any feedback, any questions, feel free to, if you're in the live lesson, to talk about that. But if not, then just add them to either our Discord or comments on the video, and I'll get back to you. So today's lesson, we're going to start with the big one, which is obviously Macbeth. I can't take full credit for how cool these slides look. This is actually based on a student of mine who's now in year 12, who did the aesthetic of this. So if you think that looks pretty cool, I do too. I can't make something that looks this good, but this is like slideshow goals as far as I'm concerned. Like if you can try and make your slideshows look this good as you're revising, it's just going to make it so much easier for you as you're revising, I think. So when we come to Macbeth, we need to think about his fool arc. So I'm just going to very quickly put this in. I know that makes it a lot uglier, but I'm going to delete this in a minute. So with the fool arc, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be thinking about what Macbeth is like. Now, technically, this is also known as an Oedipal or Oedipus story arc. You can look that up if you want to. It's an ancient Greek sort of tragic plot type narrative, all very A-level stuff that I nerdily learned when I was at uni. But for GCSE, you just need to know it's called a fool arc. So what happens in a fool arc? And for those of you that are doing Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, the first lesson we talk about Dr. Jekyll, and it's the same sort of thing, very similar sort of process in his fool arc as Macbeth's. So we start with a positive value. We start with Macbeth being quite a high up member of society, basically. So he's a Thane. He's the Thane of Glamis. He is very well respected in Scotland generally. He's got a beautiful castle. He's got a wife that he loves, and everything's going great for him, basically. But instead of accepting that, it actually gets better, right? Because then there are these rebels that try to take over Scotland. You've got MacDonald, you've got the Norwegian king, and Macbeth and Banquo are the two characters that go out and fight these battles and win them for Duncan. And so they're like the guys right now in Scotland. They are like the people in Scotland, the most famous, the most respected. He has it all. He's basically the most powerful person in Scotland outside of King Duncan himself, and arguably maybe Malcolm, his son, who will then become king. So he's really high up the totem pole. But then what happens? Act 1, scene 3, the witches come, the weird sisters, right? And they tempt him and they say, look, you're Thane of Glamis right now, but you're going to be Thane of Cawdor soon, and then you're going to be king after. And part of Macbeth's fall is really his psychological issues, which are the fact that he actually listens to the witches, listens to his wife, listens to his ambition, rather than thinking logically, wait a minute, I'm one of the most rich, wealthy, successful people in Scotland. I probably shouldn't murder an innocent person to get even more than that. But obviously he does. That's where we get to the kind of the base in some ways, the trough, like the lowest point here of his fall to begin with. And then things start to get a little bit better, at least on paper, at least superficially, because you know, he is the King of Scotland. Some of the men and women, the thanes, lords, ladies, do follow him and think he's okay, at least to begin with. He obviously has all this power. And Lady Macbeth is telling him, just enjoy being king now. But ultimately, and a few things go right for him. So he does manage to kill Banquo. He doesn't kill Fleance, obviously. But so things are kind of heading it up for him a little bit. And then the big peak where we get to here is in Act 4, Scene 1, which is where you have the witches creating this prophecy for him through these apparitions, these ghosts that tell him, look, you're going to be king until a person that isn't born from a woman kills you. And so, you know, you think, well, everyone's born from a woman, so how's that work, right? So it's kind of riddles and paradoxes. And also you're going to be king until Burnham Wood, this forest, climbs up Dunsinane Hill, which at the top of Dunsinane Hill is Dunsinane Castle, where Macbeth lives. And again, Macbeth's like, this is impossible. I'm going to be king forever because trees can't walk and people can't be born without mothers. So that's kind of the peak. And then what happens? He kills Macduff's family because he's angry. And this then spurs Macduff and Malcolm to come back from England with 10,000 men. They obviously overthrow Macbeth, and that's his ultimate death and demise, right? That's where he ends up. He ends up dead. He doesn't just end up dead. He ends up with his head cut off, right? This is not a good death. This is a terrible, humiliating, awful death, painful death. And everyone is celebrating. So Macduff comes in with Macbeth's freaking head held up high like this, right? And everyone's cheering and celebrating. This man has died hated. Everyone has hated him, and they celebrate his death. So it's a terrible fall arc. It's a tragedy, one of Shakespeare's tragic plays. Okay, cool. So we're going to dive into a little bit about Macbeth, some useful quotes that you should try and memorize and think about and use in essays if Macbeth comes up. So starting near the beginning of the play, you've got in Act 1, Scene 3, after the witches speak to Macbeth, he says, cannot be ill, cannot be good. This is a paradox and it's juxtaposition, so it's actually quite similar to the way that the witches speak. So immediately we get this sense at the beginning of Macbeth's character that he's conflicted. He doesn't know whether he wants to be king, whether he wants this to happen or not. And he is a little bit loyal to Duncan. He does like Duncan. What's sick to think about is he almost sees Duncan like his father a little bit. So imagine just for yourselves, I'll imagine for myself, what it would be like to think about killing your own dad for some sort of gain, right? Or a very close friend for a gain. And that's what he ends up doing. He kills Duncan, who's like a father or like his own, you know, very good friend. And then he kills Banquo, who's like his best friend. But it starts there. He knows that what he's doing is terribly wrong because he says that if he kills Duncan, tears shall drown the wind. So tears shall drown the wind. Obviously, this is linking to the fact that the people of Scotland are going to be so upset about the death of Duncan that they're literally going to cry so much, howl and whine, that the wind, the sound of the wind blowing in Scotland will be overthrown. Because obviously, you know, wind like blows, it makes that kind of howling, windy noise. That's how much people will mourn if Duncan is killed. So he knows that this is bad. And this is imagery and it's also hyperbole. So that just adds to like how evil Macbeth is when he actually does this, because he knows that killing Duncan is the worst thing that he could do and that no one wants Duncan to die. And that he's a great king. He has the divine right of kings. He has, you know, the chain of being is restored well. He's a good man. Then, as we go through further, Macbeth talks to Lady Macbeth, obviously, or more Lady Macbeth talks to Macbeth, tries to tempt Macbeth into killing Duncan. And eventually, he actually agrees. And this is in Act 1, Scene 7. And when he agrees, one of the first things he says after he agrees is this metaphor / juxtaposition, false face must hide, what the false heart doth know. And this juxtaposition is between the false face and the false heart. Yeah. So the false face is our kind of faking it. Yeah. So we all do this to some extent in certain situations. We sort of smile and nod and pretend that we're happy when actually inside we're dying or we're not happy. As students, I'm sure you know what that feels like with certain teachers, maybe that you don't get on with that well, but maybe you just kind of get on with it. You maybe just pretend that things are all right when actually you don't really like them that much. Sometimes you have to do this in friendships to some extent, even if you don't want to make a big deal out of something, you might just, smile and nod through something for a minute, but actually what your friends just told you has kind of really annoyed you. So that's the false face. It's faking your emotions through the way that you look, right? And the false heart, well, obviously the heart is meant to be like the center of our emotions, and to some extent, maybe like our morality, like our what guides us. So a false heart is like a bad heart, right? So if you have a bad heart, then it's this idea that you do bad things, you have bad intentions, you have bad morality. So effectively what he's saying here through this metaphor and through this juxtaposition is, look, we have bad hearts, dear wife, talking to Lady Macbeth. We have bad hearts, we have false hearts. We want to kill a king. There's something a bit wrong with us, right? But if we're going to manage to do this, then we need to present a false face. We have to smile at Duncan. Yes, sir, no, sir. Yeah. We have to pretend to Duncan till we stab him and kill him that we actually like him. So immediately we get the sense that Macbeth is a real piece of work, because he knows how bad he's being, he knows how bad he has to be, and yet he's willing to fake it. Okay, so that's a really important quote from Macbeth as well. Then you've got the eternal jewel, mine eternal jewel. He's talking about, this is now in Act 2 when he's actually king, and he's talking about how his throne is his eternal jewel. It's a metaphor. I should have added that in. But it's this obsessive behavior that he's showing to keep the throne, basically. He wants to keep the throne at any cost. He's willing to do anything. For those of you that are geeky enough to have seen like Lord of the Flies, I think of Schmeagol. This is his precious. He's going to do anything he can to get keep his hands on it, keep it. So this shows his ambition. It shows his obsession. It also shows his corruption. The fact that now he's king, even though at the beginning of the play, he never thought he'd have a chance of being king. He now will do anything. He'll kill anyone. He'll do whatever it takes to keep his kingdom. He'll kill children. Think about that. He's willing to kill Fleance, Banquo's son. He doesn't even bat an eyelid. He just says to the murderers, yeah, kill him. Is that all right with you? The murderer's like, yeah, we're murderers. We'll kill him. And then he ends up killing Macduff's kids as well. This is really evil, terrible things. At this same time, when he's talking about his crown being an eternal jewel, he also talks about how his crown is fruitless, a fruitless crown. So again, this is a metaphor. And the metaphor here is linking to something quite messed up. It's linking to Macbeth's infertility. So Macbeth is married to Lady Macbeth. And without having the talk with my students, when a mummy and a daddy love each other very much, they can make babies, right? So, but for some reason, I don't know why, Macbeth can't have children with Lady Macbeth. And there's different interpretations of why. Some people think that God has cursed Macbeth, won't allow him to have children because God does not want Macbeth on the throne. Others think that they were already infertile as a couple before this happened, but he can't have a son or a daughter to become the next king or queen. It's really important to understand that, because Macbeth is really annoyed. He's annoyed because, first of all, because he says later in this soliloquy that he's risked his immortal soul basically to benefit Banquo. He's killed Duncan, but he's going to hell for that. And he's not even going to benefit that by having his son or daughter become king or queen. And that's part of his obsession with killing children, because he wants to kill anyone's children, partly out of jealousy as well. He's jealous that all of these others can produce children, have kids, and he can't. And, you know, you can link that also somewhat to masculinity, I think. The fact that he is not feeling fully masculine and manly because he can't produce a child. Now, one other bonus I'll add into this one, which is a bit more intense in nature, is he talks about how he has a barren scepter in his grip. Yeah. Now, this is also imagery. And in this imagery, he's actually talking about his penis. There's no other way that I can tell you that. No, it's, you know, a bit of a sensitive thing, but he's talking about that. So the scepter is this long cane that kings and queens have. It's like a cane. So, you know, he's saying his scepter is barren. He's basically saying, you know, his equipment doesn't seem to be working for some reason. So this would have also haunted him, the fact that he, for some reason, can't seem to have a child. And all of this could link to the idea, perhaps, as I said, it's the guilt of having killed Duncan. Maybe it's something to do with Lady Macbeth on some level, or it could be God cursing them. That's another interpretation. Okay, so then we've got to think about his guilt, and then we'll write a little model paragraph for you to think about Macbeth. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? This is one of the great quotes of the play for Macbeth. What he's saying here, it's a metaphor. It's also an interrogative because it's a question, right? Rhetorical question, or not a rhetorical question because he answers saying no. The blood, there's also symbolism. So there's several things in here, really. The blood represents the fact that he is guilty. The blood is on his hands from killing these people. At the beginning of the play, he's talking about how he feels that nothing, not even the oceans of the gods, would be able to wash his hands. So imagine feeling like that. Imagine you get your hand dirty and you put it in the sea and you wave it around and maybe a river washes over it. You would expect that almost anything would come off of that, right? But what he's saying here is that he thinks that that's not the case. He thinks that the thing that he's done is so bad that he will never, ever recover from it. So just imagine that mindset. And that maybe explains why he ends up the way he does. At the end, he also then talks about how he won't yield to Macduff. Macduff gives him an option. Macduff gives him an option to surrender, but he can't take it. He can't take that offer. He's too arrogant. He's too pride-filled. And that's what's called his fatal flaw or his hamartia. Yeah, his hamartia is the fact that he can't bow to anyone else. And this is a big problem with Macbeth. So there are some of the major things about Macbeth. That's his character. That's some of the key quotes. There's tons more quotes. Obviously, the play is literally called Macbeth, so the whole book is filled with Macbeth quotes. But those are some good ones for you. I'm going to duplicate this slide, and we'll just do, to finish up the session, a model paragraph on Macbeth. So we'll think about how Macbeth is presented as a character. How is Macbeth presented? Or how is Macbeth's ambition, let's say, presented? Okay, so we'll think about that question. Now, the way that I want you to do this is the same way that I would want you to do any questions on Christmas Carol, Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, any of the other literature, actually even Lord of the Flies, Inspector Calls, anything else, Pride and Prejudice, Romeo and Juliet, whatever you're reading and studying. So you do a point at the beginning, you do ideally 2 bits of evidence per paragraph, you do some reader response, and you do some context. So let's start with the point. So Macbeth's ambition is presented. How nice is this font, by the way? I'm a big fan of this font. Macbeth's ambition is presented as incredibly toxic, and maybe we'll go a little bit smaller here, and it gets worse as the play continues. Okay, so we want to talk about progression. Now, another thing that the examiners love is if you can talk about the fall arc. As the play continues, it is a major factor within the fall arc of the character. Camera just went off. Sorry about that. I just have a weird, like, little expression on my face there. It's going to come back on in a second. So that's the point. We see this in the quote in Act 1, Scene 1. It's good if you know where it is in the play to add that in. Cannot be ill, cannot be good. Then you want to talk about the technique. So the juxtaposition of ill and good shows that initially Macbeth is conflicted about what to do. The correct thing for a gentleman or a thane in Scotland to do would be to dismiss the witches, like Banquo does. However, there is a seed of ambition that is toxic even at the beginning of the play. Okay, so that's the first bit, that's the first quote. Then we want a second quote. So, you know, this is becoming a little bit bigger of a paragraph. So let me just actually make this across the page. Hopefully you can still read that reasonably well. As the play progresses, Macbeth is more and more open to killing and doing whatever it takes to destroy, to stay king. He speaks of what's the quote that I wanted to put in here? He speaks of his, yes, fruitless crown, and the metaphor of this shows that he is no longer satisfied by simply being king. He needs a line of kings to be happy. As the reader or audience, we feel that Macbeth is becoming more and more greedy and corrupted. This is significant because in Jacobean England, do something specific about context, Guy Fawkes had recently tried to overthrow James I in the Gunpowder Plot. So Macbeth is a warning of what toxic ambition can do. So that, ladies and gents, is pretty much a model paragraph. I would say that this would get at least a level 7 in the exams, if not really get pushing towards level 8, because we've talked about the full arc, we've gone into some depth. It would be good to go even further into the metaphors potentially. So I might add in here, because the image of fruit links to fertility. So Macbeth is stating that he can have no fruit, as in no sons or daughters. Yeah, that's going to add even more marks to it. But something like that, you're breaking down evidence, you're explaining how it presents the character, you're linking it in this case to ambition. So I hope that's helpful. We've got a couple of students on today, so I'm just going to open up the chat for a second. No pressure, guys, but if either of you have a question to ask, we've got just a couple of minutes to answer a question. Otherwise, we'll wrap things up. Or the other option is if you want to put on your microphone if you have a question. So either of you, any questions about what we've covered here today? Okay, good. In that case, we'll wrap it up there. If you do have any feedback as you watch this video or anything like that, just feel free to answer, feel free to ask, and I'll answer anything that I can. Thanks. See you next time, same time next week.